It's time for us to check back in with Louisa in Mountain Path and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous readings, you can look in the description below for a playlist. "You won't be forgetting now, teacher," Rye said. "I'll remember," Louisa told her. "We's are going to eat supper at your place," Mabel said to Rye. "Mom and had Pop kill a yearling special so we's could bring up beef." "I think Pomps and Lucy Dykes aim to come early, too. Rands, he'll be late with the mail, but he'll get there in time for the fiddling." Lander and Royal and Clyde Meese came in from a long chase after the hogs. "Too bad you can't come to our music party and all," Rye said to Clyde. Mabel pulled her cousin's sleeve. "That ain't right, Rye, to tempt him when his pa's a preacher and so religious and everything." "Tempting makes you strong, so the Bible says," Rye said, glancing slyly at Teacher from the corner of her eyes. "I maybe might come," Clyde said. "Pop'll whoop you too," the younger Bill, whose day it was to wear the shoes, said. "When you're big enough to do all the plowing like you do, you're too big to be whooped," Rye told him. "Look at Samantha T. Pettigo. She does all the plowing, and I'll bet her pop ain't laid a hand on her since she was maybe 5. "My pa's sprier'n hers," Clyde answered, "but I think I'll come just the same. I always wanted to listen to fiddle music." "You'll be hearing it tonight, then. Pop, he's sure good on the fiddle, ain't he, Teacher?" "Best I ever heard," Louisa agreed, and wished that after school she might go straight home with the children and not have the painful interruption of the Golston woman. The last 2 weeks had been pleasant weeks. The weather had been mostly dry and cold, so that many children came to school. Lee Buck, on the few nights that he and Chris did not work for a time in the cave after supper, had been gay, filling Teacher's head with stories or fiddle music. Chris, though he had been silent as usual, seemed somehow less stern and less preoccupied with the old troubles he had always seemed to think too much upon. Danger for him, she thought, would never come from the Upper Valley or deputies from Jellicoe County, but from himself. He would always be safe in the valley, ringed as it was with cows and friends of the cows, ready to come quickly and tell if they saw a suspicious-looking stranger. Of late, she had hoped a little. Maybe he was learning to forget and thinking less of killing a man and more of living himself. She glanced at her watch. "We've had enough noon recess. We'll make it school time now," she said. "You won't be forgetting now to let us out early," Rye said as she settled herself by Mabel on a bench near the stove. "We'ns want to get home and make some last popcorn." "I'll dismiss real early," Louisa promised. "I want to do some work on my final reports before I go home." "You ain't a-aiming to stay up here by yourself?" Mabel asked. "Us young'uns have got to get in." "I won't stay long. It's too much trouble to take them all home," Louisa answered and called afternoon primer class. She felt guilty and felt that her guilt must show in her eyes. Rye was watching her, but Rye had watched her more than common since the afternoon that Teacher would not promise to come again next year. She feared that Rye still hoped and schemed to get Teacher back again, though the child had said nothing more of her leaving. She was glad when it was time to send them away. Clyde built up the fire so that the room might be warm, and Lander promised to drive all the hogs away so that there might be none about when Teacher walked down the road alone. The children's voices as they shouted to the hogs still came faintly from the lower road when Samantha T. opened the door and glanced quickly about the room. She wasted no time in greetings. "Can I send her in?" she asked. "Yes," Louisa said, too startled by the girl's abrupt entrance to hold much dread for the coming of the Golston woman. Samantha T. stood in front of the open door and waved toward a clump of beech trees up the road. "You must stay a while, too, and get warm," Louisa told her, "and watch the trees, too." "Can't, Teacher. I got to be a-lookin'. But the cows are all busy getting ready for their music party. None of them will be by." Samantha T. backed down the steps, still looking at teacher. It ain't only the cows. If'n her man knowed, nobody knows what he'll do. The woman came then, darting across the cleared space between the steps and trees and into the doorway where she stood and said, "Howdy, teacher," in a voice that trembled a little from fright or cold. Louisa could feel nothing but pity for her as she stood shivering under a ragged coat, her shoes and stockings caked with mud, frozen now in the cold wind. She must have come far, slipping through the trees, not daring a road or path, lying to her family, perhaps, all because of the things she knew and must tell. "I hope you didn't have a long wait. I sent the children home early as I could," she said, trying to make her voice sound casual and unconcerned, as if this visit were but an ordinary thing and not something she had dreaded for a long while. "Not long," the woman answered, moving a step or so and closing the door behind her. "Come and sit down. You must be half frozen." "No'm, I ain't so cold, but I'll set down." She seemed hardly conscious of the good fire at which she might have warmed her bare blue hands, but sat on a bench near the door, after first glancing about to see that the seat was not between two windows. "I can't stay long," she said. "I reckon you know what brings me." "Yes, I know." "I guess it's hard for one from away to understand all this." "I can't understand," Louisa burst out, the image of the stoop-shouldered, gray-eyed Barnett rising suddenly before her. "The people up there, the Barnetts, killed Davy Cow and made Aunt Elgie lose her mind and kept his fiddle, and now they want to have Chris taken?" The woman stared at a splash of mud on her shoe. "You know more'n I 'lowed, teacher." "Yes, I know that much, but not enough to understand why they hate each other so. The Barnetts ought to be satisfied." "You think so, teacher?" "Yes, why must this go on and on?" "They've always hated one another, part over their stealing, and part over all claiming the same land. John Barnett and Lee Buck both claims Church House Hill. But why should they kill Davy Cow?" The woman looked at her shoe and spoke in a low, lifeless voice. "There was a law made by the legislator once that if'n a man turned up the other man's steal, he'd get $50. Lee Buck had a little steal 'tween his house and the school. One of the Barnetts turned it up, and Lee Buck was tuck and fined or something. Lee Buck didn't know which Barnett done it. He 'lowed he'd find out. People in the inns was still a-visitin' a little then. High Pockets Harkis was havin' a singin'. Lee Buck reckoned he'd visit. He took Pomp and Hayes and Davy Cow, he warn't no more than a boy, and some of the River Meese men, and he went up there. Lee Buck sung and he fiddled. Davy Cow, not knowin' nothin', took his fiddle too. And he looked 'em all over, a-tryin' to see who had the money so's he could tell. The Barnetts, I reckon, got skeered. They rid away together. Pretty soon Lee Buck and his men, they rid away too. The Barnetts came round the ridge, a-tryin' to keep out of his way, and Lee Buck rid straight down the valley so's not to miss 'em. They met where the school roads meet, 'bout a quarter-mile above the school." "Davy Cow was killed there, I suppose?" "Yes." "Teacher, you've never heard it all. See, he wasn't the only one. Tuck Barnett and Perry Barnett, they was killed too, there in the road. Men come and took the doors from the church and school and carried 'em all home. It was an awful night, the prettiest weather I ever seed." Who killed the Barnetts, Davy?" The last word she knew was useless, for she thought of Lee Buck's chin and Hayes's eyes. "That boy had no mind for nothin' but his fiddlin'. I don't reckon he hardly ever carried a gun. He killed 'em, though, accordin' to what is writ on the records in Hargistown courthouse. Our men had druther die than get took. They swared the poor boy killed the two Barnetts and that they killed him. and the men that done all the killing is alive and a-walking about, they maybe might kill again. Yes, I know some of them that would. You're thinking on Lee Buck, I reckon. I blamed him that night, but I wouldn't blame him now so much. There be worse things than men killing men, teacher. Stealing what belongs to the dead is the worstest sin of all. The Barnetts took the fiddle and kept it, you mean? The Barnetts ain't all so low. For 6 year, that man's been a-keepin' it, a-lookin' at it every day, where he kept it hid, and a-kind-o' laughin' to himself, and him a-knowin', and me a-knowin', that Aunt Elgie, a poor old woman, wanted it so. Many's the time I've wished that God would take me out of my mind. You know the man? The woman glanced at her, looked quickly away, and still looking away, said, I know the man in a way. I've been married to him and a-livin' with him since I was 15. My man, he always hated Lee Buck, and Lee Buck's kin, and them he liked. He helped in the turning up of the steel. Does Lee Buck know? The woman shivered violently. Him know? If Lee Buck knowed, they'd both be dead. Lee Buck laughs and sings and plays the fiddle and does as he pleases, everything he pleases. It's good he thought the fiddle we heard was a ghost, Louisa said, and wondered if he did think it. Do you know it weren't no ghost? I don't believe in ghosts. I do. This valley had ought to be full of them. Dead men, a-bearing the sin of the living, can't rest easy in their graves. You think, then, that a dead man played the fiddle and took it away? The woman looked all about, behind her and through the windows, as if she feared someone might be hiding near. Satisfied, she drew closer to Louisa and talked, not in a whisper, but just above in a low, hoarse croaking. You can't tell, so I'll tell ye. My man was at the bottom of it. He knowed then in the late summer that men 'ud try to get Chris if'n he ever went across the river or to any of the big meetin's. He'd put 'em up to it, and he got men to get theirselves deputized. He got Joe Barnett, brother to the one that married our gal, and Lee or somebody kilt to take the fiddle on that rainy day and play it. What happened? Joe Barnett played it all right, and pretty soon he come a-bustin' into our house, his eyes fair poppin' from his head, his legs and face pitted and scratched with the rocks and bushes he'd tore through. He was so skeered he forgot to be careful of what he said, was how I knowed. You'll believe in haints when you hear this. A white ghost woman called him Davy Cow and screamed at him in a high voice like preachers say the angels used to leave the fiddle be and take it home. After he got to our place, he kept a-sayin' he heard the woman and the fiddle. He got drunk so's he couldn't hear, he said. Then he seed her. Then he seed him. He seed Davy Cow a-settin' on the hearth, a-singin' and a-playin' Sweet Fern, all about the wild sheep wandering all alone. He'd scream at him to hush. Then he'd walk up to him and cry 'cause he'd helped in the killing of him, and then sweared Davy had killed his brother. My man couldn't keep him quiet. The killings happened when he's just a boy like, and I reckon they laid on his mind more'n folks thought. He was like that for 3 or 4 days, a-keepin' hisself drunk. He'd set so still a-listenin', then 'peared like he'd hear, and ye just couldn't hold him. It took me and my man and my gal, the one her man got killed, to hold him when he'd take one of them hearing spells. Sometimes he'd see 'em, the dead Barnetts and the dead cow, and he'd try to hide or he'd scream. I didn't take it and keep it. He got so bad sometimes in the night, seemed to me like all them dead men was there a-watchin' and a-laughin' at us. I know I heard 'em a-walkin' on the porch one windy night. We couldn't tell nobody. His folks hates the cows, but they don't hold by sich and never knowed what went with the fiddle. I wished I knowed now. I went one day to try to find it. Well, the Barnett boy finally got better. I could see, though, he was still a-thinking and a-talking to my man. My man's weakly, and the boy's been a-living with us mostly for the last year or so and a-helping in the work I can't do. They'd never let me hear, but sometimes I'd be standing on the kitchen porch and I'd see 'em in the barn lot, a-talking, low-like, and Joe a-begging off, peered-like. I knowed my man was up to something. I heard him say that, and John Barnett, that's the old ones, was a-aiming to get Chris and Lee Buck too. Him and Joe went to Harristown a little later. The men tried to take Chris at meeting and didn't. My man never told me what they done in Harristown, but the boy hid out. He got scared. I kept asking him what he reckoned went with the fiddle, and he got to thinking again and a-drinking. My man tried to shut him up, but he couldn't. They got theirselves deputized, getting power to help men go after Chris and maybe get Lee Buck at his stealing. They'd made it a point to meet a man from the Adage of Tennessee, the one that helped the man Chris killed Chris's brother. You've heard of him, right, I reckon? Yes. Bill Daughtry is his name. Chris wants very much to meet him. The woman sighed. He's a-going to. That's what I'm finally a-telling you. He's a-comin' with another man and slip up on Lee Buck and Chris in the cave. Louisa clamped her hands hard about her drawn-up knees. She did not want this woman to see their shaking. They couldn't find them. Not there. They don't know the cave. They don't, but my man and some of the Barnetts does from being all over it a long time back. They know Lee Buck steals in it, and they've got a pretty good idea just where. Your husband, will he come with the other men? He promised 'em he would, but I don't think he will, not now. He's a-getting scared too. He's too quiet-like, and he drinks too much. He'll set so long just staring into the fire. Sometimes he screams in his sleep. He stays by me in the house a lot. 'Pears like he don't like to go by himself into the woods or no place. Something lays heavy on his mind. From what Joe said, they've already told him that's a-comin' too much. Told him to go down the river to the mouth of the cave. The river? Yes, the river. They'll come that way. When it's high, like it'll be in a week or so, and they can get right in the mouth of the cave with a boat, they'll come a-sneaking like in the night. You mean they'll risk nothing in the open? She felt cold and sick and cut off from all her life past by this woman and her words. Yes, the men from away and my man are that low. They'll be afeard of comin' like thieves in the night. They ain't the law, she burst out in a louder voice, but just men a-aimin' to kill other men. I don't reckon any of the high sheriffs around'll so much as know they're comin'. Chris, since he killed that man, is fair game for all. They could kill him and Lee Buck too, and then swear. You can't keep them from coming? No, I can't do that. I might hate my man till he won't come, and none from the other end 'ud risk it, but I can't keep back from away. Why did you tell me all this when there's nothing I can do or you can do? Louisa said, and got up and tried to walk, but could only stand, moving her foot a little. She had not noticed the numbness creeping into her legs while she sat too tense and listened too long. I know you can't do nothing, the woman answered. I knowed it all the time. If'n you told, Lee Buck and Chris and the others would be at my door 'fore dinner time, and more men left dead, and their women worse than dead. I might warn them, get Chris to go away. The woman sprang up and glared at her with her bright dead eyes. They'd suspicion, they'd know. You can't do it, not a word. But I must do something. I can't sit around and wait, and... Louisa cried and wondered if she too were slipping into the world this woman lived in, a world of dread and hatred and waiting and silence. Why did you tell me? She repeated again. She hated the woman. She made her see things that she did not want to see. The Golston woman grew suddenly gentle. "You'll always hate me for telling you something you can't tell. That's the biggest burden a woman can have. I know you can't do nothing but think." She got up and arranged her shawl. "I've been a-carrying this in me, the worst of it, for 6 years. For 6 years I've thought every day old Elgie Cow's a-going out of her mind. I learned that a long time back. A-looking and a-pining for something I could take her. Now I can't ever take it to her. I can't find it myself. Every day I've thought Lee Buck and them other cows'll come for my man 'fore sunset, and every night I've thought they'll come 'fore daylight. It's drove me out of my mind. You don't believe in Hank," she say. She caught Louisa's arm and stared into her eyes. "When it rains on the roof boards and on the leaves, I hear 'em sometimes, them men they sweared lies on. I hear 'em a-walkin', and the cow fiddle, and old Elgie a-cryin'. I hear 'em all in the rain." Louisa tore herself away. Here in this lonesome valley the dead had always been too close, the old dead who would not die. The woman dropped her face into one hand and rubbed her eyes. "I've skeered you," she said. "Don't make me go away. I want to ask you something. I can tell you nothing of the cows. It ain't what you think. It's Corey. Is she well, or is she in the family way again? Can she still laugh and sing and shout in church?" "Yes, she still sings and laughs and shouts. She seems well." "Is the little boy Pete, I ain't never seed him, a-growin' up brown like Corey, or pale and pretty like some of Lee Buck's people?" "He looks like Chris." "Chris was the prettiest little boy I might nigh ever seed. His ma, what's the use?" She held out her hand. Louisa took it mechanically, without wanting to. "I thank you for letting me come, teacher. I'll always remember you. We'll never see one another again, most like." "I don't think so," Louisa said. She was glad she could drop the cold, twisted hand and let the woman go away. She tried not to look after her, but the woman's eyes were still upon her as she moved to the door. "Remember to be looking for something on a cold night when the river's high and the moon bright, enough for men to see by," she said, raising her voice a little. Louisa stood without thinking to close the door and stared at the empty road and the black lacy twigs of the beech trees until she remembered that she was still teacher. Teacher must put on her hat and coat and make the fire safe and lock the door and walk down the road to Lee Buck's. There she would see Corey, and Corey would look at her and say, "How was school today, teacher?" And she would answer, "Fine," and that was all she could ever say. She understood now why most Hill women believed so in God. They had to have something. They were so alone. She was alone too. She had never been so alone. What a chapter that was. So much sadness, so much angst and anger and deceit from all of them. They're all deceitful. Both sides, we find out in this chapter that they all are. And the craziest part to me is, why did the Golston woman want to tell teacher if she didn't want teacher to tell them? That's the part, the mystery to me. Apparently she just wanted someone else to share her burden of having to endure knowing all that, I guess. So lots of angst in this chapter. I'm thinking that we're headed to a conclusion somewhere close by. We are getting towards the end of the book, but just the dramatic increase in this chapter of knowing now that the people are going to come. They're going to come after Chris and Lee Buck when they're in the cave. It's not even the law that's coming. It's actually just the other people, the Barnetts, the people that are wanting to get them back in the same way that Chris wants to get them back. It's a real mess, that's for sure. Lots of different things in this chapter. There was so much conversation, so a lot of the language, I really enjoyed a lot of the language back and forth. A lot of words jumped out at me. Again, they're using poor like we talked about in the last chapter. Just the whole conversation and the way too that Samantha T's kind of the she's the go-between, so she's fixed all this up. She obviously likes both sides of the valley, of the holler or whatever, the valley I guess it is in that situation. But she wants to help the Golston lady, but again, my question is, why did the Golston lady want to tell Louisa all that if she didn't want her to go home and tell and warn Lee Buck and Chris? And we'll have to see. Louisa says she's not going to warn them, and I think part of it is that she don't want to get involved, but part of it is she thinks it won't do any good. Like, they're not going to listen to her. They're still going to go about their day and go about their way, and whatever happens will happen. But I think I would go tell them. You'll have to tell me what you think, if you think you'd go tell them. I hope you'll leave a comment and let me know what you thought about this chapter. So much in it, so much angst and anger, and despair for Louisa and for the woman, because both of them know there's really nothing they can do about it. Even though they both understand what's going on, they can't stop it, is what they're feeling. That would be terrible despair for sure. So please leave me a comment and let me know what jumped out at you in this chapter. And I hope you'll keep dropping back by, because we've got to find out what happens next to Louisa in Mountain Path.